For our second lesson on trade, we're going to focus on trade barriers and the removal of trade barriers and also the impact on consumer and producer surplus. So a few of these notes are really general, and I'm just going to recommend you stop and look at them a little bit. This is just showing you that over the past 50 years, nations have moved toward greater trade liberalization. So you can see exports as a share of GDP. This is for developed countries. There's been, slow but steady progress over time. Obviously, very, very dramatic progress for Germany. And this is for some emerging countries. So you can see it's really up and down for some of them. In particular, Russia, right? When first Russia opened up, there was tons and tons of trade, and of course it fell from there. But these other developing economies, for the most part, China, Brazil, and India have been, for the most part, on an upward trend in terms of the amount of trade they engage in. This is the United States. This is comparing exports and imports, and you can see that both have definitely risen since 1975, but of course imports have risen much, much more dramatically than exports because we have a huge trade gap, and you can see that illustrated by the difference between those two lines, the trade deficit. And then this just shows you, and this is some good information to have in terms of Quiz Bowl. It's a little bit outdated now, but you can see in terms of exports, we export more to Canada and Mexico than anywhere else. But if you go over to the import side, you can see we import more from China, and that remains true. And our total volume of trade with China is quite high, although our total volume of trade, Canada is still number one if you add together imports and exports. So we can see that we've moved toward trade, but yet lots of people are against trade, and the reason for that is because not everyone benefits. And so if we look at this, this is an autarky sugar market, and if you remember I said last time, autarky means not open to trade. And if this economy, the U.S. in this case, decides to open to trade, the world price might be higher or lower than our domestic price. So let's say that the world price, most likely it's going to be lower. So let's say the world price is down here. So let's analyze this in terms of consumer and producer surplus. Before we opened ourselves to trade, right, this was our equilibrium price, and this triangle would have been our consumer surplus, and the lower triangle was our producer surplus, right? So that would be our market equilibrium. Now, at the world price, things are going to change a little bit, because if we just totally take down all of the barriers and we say we are open to world trade, then what you're going to end up with is actually this quantity, okay? That's going to become the price, and where the price crosses the demand curve is going to tell us the quantity that's going to actually be bought and sold, which means the consumer surplus is now this gigantic triangle, right? So consumer surplus gets much larger under trade, but as you can see, this right here is the amount that will be domestically supplied, or the amount that will be produced by domestic producers. So their producer surplus is going to be just this little tiny triangle. Okay, so the producers have lost a lot of surplus, and the consumers have not just gained a lot of the producer surplus, but have also added this net gain here. This is our net gain from trade. Okay, so that's a nice little illustration of what happens, but of course the producers are going to be very unhappy because of this situation, so they're going to lobby for trade barriers, and trade barriers are going to impact the size of the consumer producer surplus. So the trade barriers or trade restrictions that we know about, that we talk about primarily, are tariffs, quotas, and subsidies. So if we have here this world price, and we have here, this is what's being demanded and purchased, right, and this is what's being produced domestically, and let's say that we get put in place either a tariff or a quota. Either of those is essentially going to create a new line like this. Okay, this is going to be, we're going to call this the price with a tariff. So this is basically the world price moving up by the amount of the tariff. So let's say this represents a tariff of, $10 or something. So now we're paying an additional $10. So what happens to the size of our surpluses? Well, we had a consumer surplus that was like this on the last slide, right? And we had a producer surplus that was like that. Well, now consumers are not being able to buy as much anymore, right? Because of this new price with the tariff or with the quota. If it's a quota, it's basically a quantity imposed, and if it's a tariff, it's a price imposed. So either way, we can say you can only import this much, or we can say you have to charge this much extra. It's going to have the same impact. So now the domestic consumers are buying this much, and the domestic producers are supplying that much. So our consumer surplus will actually shrink, right? This is the new consumer surplus now. Okay, and the producer surplus will grow. So producer surplus becomes this. Okay, so when the producers successfully lobby for trade barriers, they increase their own surplus and they reduce the consumer surplus. If this is in fact a tariff, then this rectangle, okay, which is the quantity of imports, okay, times the size of the tariff, this is the actual tariff. This is the revenue to the government. What I shaded in here is revenue to the government. And oddly, these two triangles here and here, that's our deadweight loss. So it's a really unconventional deadweight loss, right? But that was part of consumer surplus, and now it's gone. So some of the consumer surplus gets transferred to the producers, some becomes government revenue, and some becomes deadweight loss. So that's one thing that can happen. Another possibility is that we could have trade barriers in the form of a subsidy, which is different. Okay, a tariff is going to be a tax on imports. A quota is going to be a quantity limit on imports. But a subsidy is actually going to be a payment to the domestic producers. So let's go back to where we were here. This is the quantity being demanded domestically, and this is the quantity being supplied domestically, and the difference between the two is imports. Okay, and rather than restricting imports or putting in place a tariff, what we're going to do is we're going to subsidize domestic producers. So what will happen is this supply line will shift to the right. This is supply with a subsidy. So what happens? Well, from the consumer's perspective, nothing. They're still able to buy what they bought before. They're still shopping over here. Okay, the difference is that now the domestic producers are able to contribute more, and the quantity of imports goes down. Okay, so imports are down, domestic production is up, and the consumers are none the wiser. So this seems like a better solution, except, of course, this money, this quantity, this payment, which is this size, okay, is coming from our tax dollars, because we've got to get the money from somewhere to subsidize the producers. So that would be a drawback. I did want to mention, since I said this on the original slide when I was showing you the consumer producer surplus, the world price could also be higher. Right? The world price could be up here. It's going to have a different impact if you open an autarky market to trade and the world price is actually higher than the domestic price was. So you can imagine, rather than benefiting the consumers, now this is going to actually benefit the producers. So what will happen is all of this, right, all of this at the world price now, the producers are selling, and most of it is becoming exports, right? Not all of it. This little bit here, okay, this little bit here is what domestic consumers are now able to afford, that higher price, and here's their consumer surplus, all right? And the rest of it, all of this, right? This is all producer surplus, but this quantity is actually exports. Okay, so they're sending quite a bit of it away overseas. So the consumers aren't too happy in this situation. And usually there's not much they can do about it, unfortunately. So why else do protesters oppose free trade? Well, the people who oppose free trade typically, right, are the domestic producers, and they oppose it because they're losing revenue and they're losing jobs. And protesters have a lot of reasons for being opposed to free trade. For example, lax environmental regulations in other countries, lower wages in other countries, lost jobs are also part of it. So there's a lot of reasons why people oppose free trade. And I would recommend looking at some of these just to get some of the details. The WTO protests focused on things like hypocrisy, on how U.S. farmers actually sell products at below the cost of production, which then actually drives people in other countries out of business. Okay. These are a few things that you should know just for probably for Quiz Bowl. GATT stands for General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and that was signed by 23 nations in 1947. In over 8 rounds of negotiation, they dropped tariffs by 33%. That led to the creation of the WTO. So GATT is not really in place anymore. Those discussions aren't happening. This is a nice little graphic that shows you U.S. tariffs as a percentage of imports from 1860 to 2000. The one that usually comes up, if anything comes up, is this one, which is the Smoot-Hawley tariff. And that was put in place during the Depression to try to protect American businesses and American jobs. Highest level you can see on average, almost 60%. And of course, it's credited now with helping spread the Depression all over the world, because every country slapped on response tariffs, and then there was very little trade. But after World War II, you can see pretty quickly after World War II that GATT started, right, and our general levels of tariffs went way, way, way down compared to where they were during the Depression. Okay, trying to move on to the next page here. Okay, the International Monetary Fund was formed in 1945. This was started in order to promote international monetary cooperation and stable exchange rates to promote economic growth and provide temporary assistance to countries. Wealthier countries get more control of the IMF, and the U.S. actually gets 20% of the voting power. Another is the EU, the European Union. This was originally officially established in 1957, but they created a single market in 1993 and abolished customs checks and passport usage. This is probably wrong on the number of states now. We'll have to double check that. There's more than 27 member states now, and their goal, of course, was to reduce the transaction costs of European trade. The euro was introduced in 1995, although it wasn't officially used that early. NAFTA was signed in 1993. That is the free trade zone created with the North American Free Trade Agreement, U.S., Mexico, and Canada. And as you can see, it actually helped increase GDPs in all three countries because of lowering trade barriers. The WTO, which was the what followed GATT, the World Trade Organization, similar to some of the other organizations. In this one, all the member countries have equal votes, and this is actually headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland, rather than being headquartered in New York or D.C. It's very controversial. It's got a very strong voice. It rules on trade disputes. It is seen as not being a very strong protector of the environment. So those are a few drawbacks. Dumping is a term that you want to know. It means manufacturers in a particular country are exporting a product to another country at a price either below the price charged at home or below the actual cost of production. So dumping would be, for example, China was accused of dumping TVs on the market. So they were actually, selling TVs in the United States for less than the cost of production. And you do that to intentionally run another country's businesses out of business, essentially. So countries accuse each other of dumping, and sometimes they actually get, international hearings. Currency battles, we'll talk more about currency next time, but another way to try to influence trade and cause problems between countries is to try to devalue your currency. As we'll see next time, devaluing your currency helps your exports and it limits imports and it causes an imbalance of trade. And finally, just to give you a picture of what trade protections do when you have protected industries, and these are a few of them, like benzenoid chemicals, luggage, softwood lumber, etc. Costume jewelry is my favorite one. This kind of shows you how much we spend, and then, I don't know if I have costume jewelry on here, and then how many jobs it actually saved. So for example, in the ball bearings industry, we spent $88 million in trade protections for 146 jobs, which seems a little ridiculous. You don't need to know those numbers. It's just to give you an idea that when we do have trade protection, it frequently ends up being a very expensive way to save jobs. And that is the end for this week.